Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, based on where you're joining us from today. You could have chosen to be anywhere, but chose to spend time with us, so we do appreciate that and hope to make this a valuable use of your time. Today's presentation is entitled Improving Individual and Organizational Decision Making, presented by Professor Steve Walton of Goizueta Business School at Emory University, in collaboration, of course, with Ivy Exec. My name is Niatu Benciential. I'm the Senior Content Manager here at Ivy Exec. I'll be helping to moderate today's session. Before we start, I'd like to go over a couple of brief housekeeping items for the audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions. You can do so using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. This will be on either the left or right-hand side of your screen. In the final 15 minutes of the presentation, there will be a formal Q&A session, so please hold your questions until then. In addition, and finally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in a few business days. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Professor Steve Walton. Steve is an award-winning professor at Emory's Goizueta Business School, and Dr. Walton has an extensive consulting background in the areas of strategy, decision-making, process improvement, environmental operations, and supply chain management. His clients include Sony, First Data, UPS, and several other large corporations you're quite familiar with, such as SunTrust, Panasonic, and so on. Prior to working within academia, Steve worked at IBM. And with that, it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Steve to take you through the presentation. Steve?
Thank you. Good morning, afternoon, evening to all of you. Thanks for spending time with us today. What we're going to talk about is very much related to individual and organizational decision making, but a very specific piece of it that I've been paying attention to for a number of years. Let me describe. I don't know what your experience is, but mine seems to work around this idea of being really busy. I don't know if this resonates with you, but I feel sometimes like I'm more busy than I am productive. And this image of this guy kind of captures that. So many calls, so many emails. And in fact, I don't know your experience, but I've been noticing lately that if you ask somebody, how are you doing? The most common answer that I get back is, oh, I'm so busy. And then what seems to happen is almost this one-upsmanship of who's busier. Oh, I'm so busy too. Let me tell you about it. It's as if busy has become a thing. And I want to think about that. Well, here's another great example about this. There's a book, I've not read it, so I don't recommend it, only because I don't know it. There's a book entitled Deep Work. What's really interesting about this book is it says what you ought to do is sometimes you have to get deep work done. So you need to get rid of distractions. You need to make sure you're rested. Well, if you distill it down to its core, what it's saying is think. Something really interesting is happening around being busy and thinking and making decisions. What got me into this was I was this guy. And a number of years ago, about 4 years ago, it was early in the morning. It was maybe 5:30, and I was driving to work. And I pulled up to a stoplight, looked over to my left to make sure there were no cars coming. It was a right turn, so I was getting ready to turn right on red. There were no cars, except for the one that I didn't see because I was so tired. I was nearly hit. I avoided the accident, but it really struck me that there's something about the way the brain works and rest and all of these other things that I needed to understand. And so for the past 4 years, I've been working on the physiology of leadership, the physiology of individual effectiveness, and particularly what we'll talk about today is the physiology of decision making. Now, if you stop for a second and you think about the brain, and it was time to make an important, big, strategic decision, what would you want to be true? I've been thinking about this a lot, and the sort of almost quick answer that comes to my mind is, I want the biggest brain possible. And so here's just kind of two funny images. One is the movie Mega Minds, and the other is an old sci-fi movie. But you think about, if you're going to make a big, hard, complicated decision, I want the most effective, biggest brain that I can get. But it raised an interesting question. Why is it that we make choices and do things that the research into human physiology shows reduces the volume of our brain? it was really interesting to me. I needed to understand this more. And I started looking into, or at least really thinking about, what is it that we as at least Americans, but I think it's business people in general, what is it we really think about how the brain works? And I was struck by a number of things. And let's take our sci-fi brain, the black and white brain right here, and take that another step. What it seems we believe is that the brain is separated from the body, that the brain works independently of the rest of the physiology that is us as a person, almost as if it's encased in a machine. Or maybe if you take another step, maybe what we seem to believe is the brain is a machine, that it works like a computer. And neither of these is true. And in fact, the brain is in a way a machine. It's one of the most complex machines you can come across, but it's not an isolated machine. It is awash in biochemistry. It is surrounded by physical anatomy. There's a lot of stuff going on in the brain that, at least the way that I hear executives talking about decision making, it's as if the brain is one of these two things right here. And that's what I want to explore with you over the course of our time together today. We need to understand how the brain really works. And we could spend our entire time together talking about the brain and anatomy and its impact on decision making. I want to distill that down into just one or two ideas, because it drives to what I think is the really interesting stuff about organizational decision making. All right, so think about the brain broadly as you start activating portions of the brain that are higher and further forward, the prefrontal cortex in our picture here. That is the more advanced portion of the brain. It was evolutionarily the latest to develop. And it turns out, even in people today, the prefrontal cortex develops last in a person. So for example, a male, typically the prefrontal cortex doesn't finish developing until early mid-20s. So think about the prefrontal cortex as the more advanced portions of the brain. As you move back and down to the limbic system, this is more primitive portions of the brain. My colleagues in the College of Arts and Science don't like it when I say this is kind of the lizard portion of the brain, but it sort of is. The physiology of this portion of your brain looks very similar to almost every other animal. So let's look at these for just a second, because another really interesting thing arises here. So the prefrontal cortex, it's also called the executive center of the brain. And here's some of the things that it's responsible for. I'll give you a second to look at it. So as you look at these, managing emotions and frustration, sustaining focus, managing alertness, organizing, prioritizing. These are the skills that a business leader needs to make hard strategic choices. Says slightly differently, when it comes to making business decisions, virtually all of the business decisions that we make, we want the prefrontal cortex most active. There are occasions, crises, building on fire, that no, we don't have time to do these. But if you think about most of the decisions that we make, this is kind of what we want going on. All right, limbic system. As the more primitive portion of the brain, you can think of the limbic system as broadly controlling emotions. This is all broadly true. There's a lot of nuance into the brain. We'll save that for another time. It controls the fear center. It controls more reactive stuff. If you wanted a really simple way to think about the limbic system in general, it's the fight or flight thing. It's where that sort of raw emotion of should I run, should I stay, or should I go now? Now here's the interesting question. What is it that causes strategic decision making to leave the prefrontal cortex and move back into the limbic system? If there's a pattern to why decisions are moving, strategic decisions are moving from the prefrontal cortex back to the limbic system, maybe there's things that we can do to improve our own individual decision making and to improve organizational decision making. Because if decisions move to the limbic system, they are reactive. They tend to be higher risk. You can go through all of the things that when the limbic system takes over, it doesn't fit well with strategic decision making. There's 100 things we could talk about. I've narrowed it down to 3. And I think these are the 3 big ones that we should spend some time thinking about while we're together. They are sleep. Sleep doesn't do what most people think it does. Or maybe more accurately, we view sleep as simply rest. It's much more than that. Second, and related, stress. Stress is what kicks in that fight or flight. And I wonder if organizations aren't built right now, or at least our view of work life isn't built right now to almost be constantly stress inducing. And that has impact on decision making. The third one is distractedness. And there's some interesting things about expectations of always on and what we do with our devices, for example, that we need to look at, because all 3 of these individually, when poorly managed, move decision making out of the prefrontal cortex, and then they interact with each other. And that's what I want to explore with you over our time together. So let's start with sleep. Sleep is a really interesting thing. And what I want to do is I have 2 poll questions. We'll take them one at a time. I want to get your reactions, your responses to these 2 questions. The first question: how much sleep do you typically get in the night? So Niato, if you would launch that poll for us, that would be great.
The poll is live, and we'll leave it open for about 30 seconds. I'll give it about 10 more seconds. All right, looks the majority of people have responded, so I'll go ahead and close the poll now. And here are the results, Steve. 0% report less than 4 hours. 29% report between 4 to 6. The vast majority, 66%, report between 6 to 8 hours of sleep, and the remaining 6% report 8 to 10 hours of sleep.
Well, that's really interesting. And in fact, that's great. The typical person requires around 7.5 hours of sleep. We'll talk a little bit about some of the nuances of that in just a minute. And so that as a group, most of you are getting around 6 and 8. That's actually pretty good. The typical American, like I said, gets about 7, and bad things happen when you're getting insufficient sleep. But here's the interesting question, and it's our second poll question. It is, how much sleep do you feel like you need in a night to be productive? So Niato, if you don't mind launching that one.
Yep, all set. Thank you everyone for your participation so far. I'll leave it open for a few more seconds. All right, majority voted. I'll close the poll now. And here are the results. So 14% report feeling that they need between 4 to 6 hours. The vast majority, 57%, feel they need between 6 to 8, and 28% say 8 to 10, and finally 1% report needing more than 10 hours of sleep.
That's awesome. Y'all are a really enlightened crowd. I appreciate that. Thank you for your responses. What I want to talk about is, what is the implication of sleep? What does sleep really do? So it is true that sleep is partly just a mechanism of rest, but that's an incomplete story. One good way to think about sleep is very much like daily maintenance for your brain, and actually for your whole body, but we'll spend our time thinking about the impact of sleep on the brain. Every day, as you're going through your typical day, as you're making decisions, as a car cuts you off driving down the road, as your partner says, I love you, as all of these things are taking place, a lot of stuff's happening in your brain. Little pieces of proteins are left as residuals. A little bit of serotonin is left in the brain. There's a tad bit of dopamine left in the brain. There's some adrenaline left. there, all of the hormones and biochemistry of your brain has been going kind of ebb and flow through the course of the day. Now, when you get to the end of the day, in a sense, somebody's got to come and clean up the brain. And that is one of the dominant roles of sleep. It is about resting the body. And there's a truth that sleep is a time for muscular healing and things like that. All true. But it's only when you sleep that a couple of things happen in your brain that are really, really important. First, the hormonal and biochemical balance of the brain is restored. Second, all of those proteins, these sort of fragments of decisions and activities through the course of the day, are cleaned out. Now, what you need to know about these proteins, kind of at a high level, is these proteins, if they continue to accumulate in the brain, are associated with cognitive decline. So these proteins, they matter a lot, and getting them out of the brain becomes really important. So sleep is rest, but really the best way to think about sleep from a decision-making perspective is it's when your brain gets cleaned back up. The other thing that happens in sleep is memory consolidation. The brain has got to make choices about what it keeps and what it discards. It needs to decide that the color of the car that cut you off doesn't matter and pare that memory out. But by the same token, the conversation with you that you had with your boss, that needs to get consolidated as part of your long-term memory. These things happen only in sleep. Without sleep, you can see the impact that this would have on cognition. And very specifically, what the research shows is if you deprive yourself of as little as 30 minutes of sleep a night over the course of as little as a week, you're working at a level of impairment that matches legally intoxicated. Think about that for a second. For those senior executives, say Tim Cook or Elon Musk, who brag about getting by on 3 to 5 hours of sleep a night, they're leading major organizations in this sort of state where if they're like most people, their brain's not working the way it ought to. Now, some information that you need to know. As you can see, here's a list of some of the things that sleep does. Sleep debts accumulate. And because it's not just about rest, it's about the biochemistry of the brain, including the accumulation of these proteins, it's hard to pay back a long-term sleep debt. It could take months to clean up all of the stuff that's in your brain. Now, the good news is research suggests that it can be cleaned up, but sleep debts are hard to pay back. Here's things that you need to know that allow you maybe to make some choices about how you manage sleep. Pretty much everybody needs between 7 and 9 hours. Everybody is different, but most people, about 97% of people fall inside this range. There's a small fraction of the population, it's about 3%, that carries a gene that allows them to get by with less sleep, 6-ish hours. We're not all on this call, right? So that you are sleeping around 7 to 8 hours, that's actually really, really good. Sleep follows predictable patterns. And this is one of the reasons why you need about 8 hours, long enough, because there's a sleep architecture of more wakedness, REM sleep, deeper sleep that your body goes through, and it needs to go through these cycles a couple of times a night. What's interesting, circadian rhythm isn't set by what time you get up. Sometimes people say, I need to go to bed at, and there's a truth to that. But circadian rhythm is dominantly set by the time that you wake up, which leads to some interesting things. I don't know if you have that thing where you get up early on weekdays and then sleep in on weekends. It's got a name. It's called social jet lag. If you do this, let's say you get up at 5 on weekdays and then you get up at 8 on your weekend nights or weekend mornings, what you've done from your body's perspective is you've gone to California. The distance from Atlanta to California, 3 time zones. It's as if you changed your location by the way you manage your time to get up. Some of you may be thinking things like, well, I'll read in bed. I'll check my email one last time. I'll watch some TV in bed. To prepare for this, I've done some talking with sleep professionals, including sleep psychologists. One of them uses the phrase, the bed is for two things only. I'll let you figure out what those are. But if you're reading in bed, what you're doing is training your brain to be awake in bed. And one of the really interesting things that this sleep psychologist said is sleep management is light management. Now, this has huge impacts about how we manage our devices around bedtime. And what I want to do is present you kind of a broad list of the kinds of things that you could do now that could improve your sleep. And I'll tell you as I go to this list, some of them are easy, some of them are harder. And I'll just comment on one or two of them. If you can, be done eating 2 hours before bed. The digestion interferes with sleep. But there's also some interesting things about when you eat, sleep, and long-term cognition. So be done eating 2 hours before bed. Routines. We have routines for our kids, and we see how they react to them. What's happening with routines around bedtime is you're signaling to the brain it's time to wind down. Those are great things for us to do too. Other things. And this one's really hard. If you find yourself awake in the middle of the night, don't stay in bed. If you are awake for 10 or 15 minutes, go ahead and get up. It seems counterintuitive, but you'll break some sleep cycles where you're saying to yourself, oh, I've got to go to sleep now. Go downstairs, read for 20 minutes. Typically, that's more effective than lying in bed. And maybe what you can do is you can think about this list and pick one, maybe two that you want to try. All right, let's go on. Let's talk about the second one, stress. Now, stress comes in a couple of ways, right? You can think about sort of acute stress. That's that, right? That's the fight or flight, I'm being chased by people with spears thing. Or there's sort of chronic stress. The chemistry, the biochemistry that creates both of those is the same. And it turns out that the one that we live with day to day seems to be this chronic long-term stress. So let's talk about it physically at a high level for just a second, and then we'll look in a little bit more detail about how it impacts the body so we can get to how it impacts decision-making. All right, this is the HPA axis, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, adrenal cortex, that's the HPA. The way that I want you to think about this is basically a command structure. The hypothalamus is the sort of mission control. It's sensing the environment and it sees a threat. Let's say it's a snake on the ground. That is the command center that sends a message into the body that says, I see a threat, prepare. The hypothalamus doesn't actually do, it sends that signal. That signal then goes, in a sense, to the field command office. That's the anterior pituitary. This is where that signal gets translated into a message that sounds like, deploy the troops. It's the adrenal cortex that actually does. The adrenal cortex, kind of around the kidneys, releases cortisol, which is similar to adrenaline. And that's what creates the constricted breathing, blood pressure going up, dilated pupils, all of the things that we associate with that sort of fear and stress moment. Now, here's the interesting thing. What should happen, so you look down and it's not a snake, it's a stick. What should happen is the troops in the field, the adrenal cortex, should say, oh, not a threat, stand down. That should then go back up to the field command center and make its way back up to mission control, the hypothalamus. And that would turn off the adrenal cortex. What if that signal doesn't get sent? What if you get caught in this belief that it's still a threat? Because this is kind of what's happening in most organizations. There's this low-level, constant stress. And let's look at it graphically for a second. So cortisol is a natural part of sort of the human daily experience. And you can see here, and we'll pay attention to the top graph and the bottom graph. Cortisol as a stimulant rises as it's about time to wake up. and then sort of falls over the course of the day, coming to its lowest level when it gets to be about bedtime. And so for many people who are in this healthy pattern, that first cup of coffee as a stimulant is more of a habit than a sort of a physiological need. And then you can see sort of awakeness, something about 3 in the morning. There's this little roll over thing, and you can see it on the left-hand side of that top picture. But we usually don't wake up. We're just going right back to sleep. The research is unclear about this center pattern, the so-called adrenal fatigue pattern. That's a point of contention in the research, but this bottom one is widely accepted. This one is basically cortisol fatigue. This is long-term chronic cortisol stimulation. And what you can see by the red line in that bottom graph is that cortisol is constant throughout a 24-hour period. But I want you to look at the gaps between the bottom one and the top one. Look at wake-up time. Cortisol isn't high enough in this bottom graph to actually be alert or attentive. Then work your way through the day, where the bottom graph stays like this, and the top graph falls off. At bedtime, there's still more cortisol in the bloodstream than there should be, leading to restless sleep. Diagnostic about which one of these may be in play for an individual is what happens at 3 in the morning time. Everybody, more or less, has this rollover pattern at 3 a.m. If that rollover pattern at 3 a.m. meets long-term cortisol stimulation, what it means is bolt upright at 3 in the morning, can't go back to sleep. Mind starts racing. You start hearing things in your head like, I've got a meeting, I've got to get back to sleep now, and it only makes things worse. The top pattern is the normal pattern. The bottom pattern is this long-term cortisol stimulation pattern, which leads to a question. And I'm just curious, and this will be our next poll. Of these two, which resonates more with you? Which more seems to describe your experience? And again, one of the places that you can look is feeling really tired even though you've just woken up. Another is knowing you need to go to bed but not feeling completely tired yet. A third is waking up at 3 in the morning, unable to go back to sleep consistently. And so, Niatu, if you would open that poll for us.
All right, the poll has been open for a few seconds already, and we'll leave it open for about 10 more seconds for those to participate. And Steve, if you wouldn't mind giving just a really quick description of the top and the bottom one, I think the voting is slow, people trying to remember the images because the two can't be seen at the same time.
Oh, I'm sorry. The top one is the normal healthy pattern that is cortisol at its highest in the morning and then falling through the day. The bottom one is the adrenal fatigue pattern, the flat, low-level stimulation.
Thank you. Hope that was helpful to everyone. We'll leave it open for a few more seconds for you to lock in your votes. All right, we'll close the poll now. All right, here are the results, Steve. 62% felt that the top one was their cortisol pattern, and 38% felt the bottom one was more reflective of their experience.
That's good. Thank you. That's really useful information. There are challenges with this bottom graph, and it's what I want to talk about for just a minute, because cortisol stimulation is associated with all kinds of bad things. And this is a complicated picture. I'll give you a second to look at it. What I want you to take away from it is if one is under long-term cortisol stress, it has impacts on your immune system. It has impacts on your overall biochemistry, impacting sleep, impacting mood, impacting decision-making, and it also impacts physical health. But here's the problem. Maybe it's not a problem, but here's another thing. Stress is really complicated. Not all stress is the same. Some stress, as you know, is motivating stress. It's called challenge stress. Other stress, maybe when it goes too far, or other types or sources of stress, are demotivating stress, so-called hindrance stress. Another way people look at this is about sort of optimal stress levels. Eustress is a term that's used to describe insufficient stress, right? With no stress, we don't really do much. And you can see as stress levels increase, performance rises to a point. And then there's a peak where more stress is associated with decreased performance. A study was done by the Rand Institute that suggests that $411 billion a year in economic impact to the US economy based on high levels of stress inside employees. The relationship between stress and productivity is really clear. So a couple of things that you need to know about stress so that we can start moving towards what could you do. Here's that feedback loop between stress and sleep. If one becomes stressed, it impacts their sleep. If one isn't sleeping, it tends to impact stress. Now, all of these tend to move decision-making out of the prefrontal cortex and back and down towards the limbic system. And long-term low-level stress is associated with cellular level damage. Now, what you need to know so that we can move towards some actions that you can take. Stress is a natural reaction to threats that sometimes we exacerbate by the way that we think about circumstances. Consistent stress, even at low levels, leads to this cortisol pattern. And there's a distinction that I want you to make. The distinction between dealing with the effects of stress and dealing with the source of stress or dealing with the stress itself. There are great tools to deal with the effects of stress. But eventually you've got to get down to dealing with the specific source of stress. Let me explain. So dealing with the effects of stress is doing something to help sort of alleviate the moment. Get up and walk. Any physical exercise tends to help reduce the immediate cortisol in the bloodstream. So for example, walk to the furthest bathroom away from your office. Do that twice a day. That little bit of exercise, while it doesn't give you cardiovascular benefit, it does give you stress reduction benefits, impacts the effects of stress. Breathe. For most people under this stress condition, if you were to put your hand on your belly and your hand on your chest, what should move is your belly. If you're in this stress position, what's going to be moving is your rib cage. That's shallow breathing. Another way to spot whether you're in this long-term stress pattern. Try it if you want to right now. Being attentive to your breathing, it can be frustrating, but that's one way to deal with the effects of stress. Find a meditation app. Headspace is a good one. It's one that I've used a few times. Do something that connects you with the moment. What the research suggests is a typical person spends about 60% of their time thinking about times other than now. So if now we spend 60% of our life thinking about either the past or the future. These meditation apps are just trying to get you to be in the moment. Now, eventually, you've got to deal with the sources of stress. I don't know about you, but I used to put myself in all kinds of stressful situations without even really thinking about it, and it was unnecessary. So paying attention to those, leaving buffers between meetings, for example. So one that I was guilty of. And this is something that I learned from reading a book entitled Essentialism by Greg McKeown. Good book. What he describes in his book is one of the sources of stress is we don't leave sufficient buffers between activities. Well, what I used to do, I travel a good bit, is I would try to arrive at the airport just in time to get on my plane. And it was great because I felt like I was being productive with my time, being efficient. The problem is if anything went wrong, it was hugely stressful because I might miss my flight. It could be something small, like a small delay getting out of the building. It could be something big, like an accident on the highway or a security backup. I was putting myself in these situations unnecessarily that created this long-term stress. One of the things that I learned from reading this book, Essentialism, is I'll now go to the airport earlier so that if anything comes up that would delay me, I still have plenty of time. Now, typically I get to the airport with 45 minutes to spare. Gives me plenty of time to sit down and clear a couple of emails or to work on my calendar. I've shifted the work into being at the airport instead of trying to race to the airport at the last minute. And maybe that example doesn't resonate with you, but what do we do that puts us into these unnecessarily stressful situations? Pay attention to how you're thinking. When somebody cuts you off on the highway, on the freeway as you're driving home, the typical reaction is usually something like jerk. Well, that creates a cycle of negative thinking, and then that impacts our stress levels. Last one for dealing with long-term stress. Harvard did a long-term study, about 70 years, and found out one of the most important predictors of long-term well-being is not seeking happiness, but seeking meaning, purpose. Now, however you define that, whether it's active in your house of worship, active with your family, but having a purpose bigger than yourself is associated with reducing these stress impacts that we've been talking about. All right, let's go on to distractedness for just a couple of minutes, because what's going on now is, if you think about drunk driving, the research suggests that tired driving and distracted driving risk becoming as big a problem as drunk driving. So let's look at this. And two more poll questions. The first one. I consider myself a good multitasker, and this is an agree, neutral, or disagree poll. Nyato, would you launch this one?
Yep, all set. All right, leave it open for about 10 more seconds. All right, and bring the poll to a close now. So Steve, we have 34% agreeing, 32% who are neutral, and the final 34% disagreeing about being a good multitasker.
We are just about evenly split across our three answers. The bad news, depending on how you want to look at it, the human brain doesn't multitask. It is physically impossible. Or let me be more specific. When working on cognitively heavy tasks, the brain can only do one at a time. Now, if you're talking about talking with your partner while chopping the vegetables for dinner, sure, the brain can do that because one's primarily a physical activity. But two cognitively heavy tasks, the brain can't multitask. What happens is it works on one or the other. And when you shift back and forth, the brain pays a close down cost to stop this one, and then a startup cost to begin the other one. So every time you shift tasks, it requires some brain space. All right, second poll, and it's a related poll question, just being a little bit more specific. I will routinely stop what I'm working on to respond to a text or email. And again, the choices are agree, neutral, and disagree. And Nyato, if you don't mind.
Yep, the poll is open. I will go about another 10 seconds once again. All right, and closing the poll now. All right, Steve, so we have 66% agreeing, 15% who are neutral, and the remaining 19% disagreeing.
Awesome, thank you. So here's the thing. If the brain can't multitask, and you pay this penalty for starting and closing down different jobs, what the research shows is if you're in the middle of two cognitively difficult tasks, cognitively heavy tasks, and you switch, it can take as long as 30 minutes to get your brain back to where it was on the previous task. So I don't know about you, but for me, email notifications and texts come in at a rate faster than that 30 minutes. And so one of the real things that's happening to productivity, and in a minute we'll talk about its impact to decision making, is allowing these distractions to come to us in the way that they do. It takes 30 minutes to get our brain back to where it was on the cognitively difficult job that we're working on. Now, the reality of what we live in, we've got home pressures, we've got the distraction of the internet. I love looking at Clemson football stuff. I'm a Clemson grad. Man, you can get lost in that stuff. Emails, messages, what's going on at home, the coworkers that stop by. We live in this distracted world. And it's a couple of things. First, the statistic that I love on this one is that 70% of Americans regularly use another device while watching TV. We can't even focus on our distractions. We're so distracted. And we see where it comes from, but it's not neutral. A lot of states are going to hands-free phone calls in cars. The evidence suggests that it won't help. And this is not just about driving with cell phones. It's a different thing. It's about more broadly, distractedness is dangerous. Let me explain this image to you. On the left-hand side of your screen is an image of the visual space a driver uses when not on a cell phone call, hands-free or not. And what you can see is they're looking across the periphery, they're looking high, they're looking low, they're looking near, they're looking far. The image on the right-hand side is the range of vision, eye scan, for a driver on a hands-free call. This doesn't even bring in texts or things like that, or holding the phone to your ear. What do you notice? More or less, this distracted driver is looking at the bumper in front of them. There's no sense about what's down the road, and you can see the implications of this. Similarly, go to YouTube, not right now, but when you have a moment, go to YouTube and search for text while walking fails. And what you'll get is just 100 more videos of people who are walking and texting. And sometimes it's silly things, like one woman walks into a fountain in a mall, splash. But some are scary. There's a woman walking down the street that's texting. And in major cities, they've got in the sidewalk, the doors that open up that give access to the basement. She walked right into one and over. This distractedness is dangerous. So here's what you need to know about distractedness. It reduces performance on cognitively heavy tasks by 20%. Interestingly, unrelated to decision making, but interestingly, this distractedness has broader implications. For example, distracted eaters eat about twice as much as people that are paying attention. And in some instances, in the instance, for example, of texting and driving, it increases the likelihood of accidents by 23 times. The impact of trying to multitask, it reduces effective IQ by about 10 points. I don't know about you, I don't have 10 points to spare. That's serious. So one other thing that I think you need to know, because we've talked, well, two things, these are both important. First, this habit of diversion seeking, being bored and picking up our phone, watching our iPad while we're watching our TV, sets up a negative self-reinforcing cycle. The act of diversion seeking creates this cycle where the brain becomes more active in diversion seeking. And maybe diagnostic is every time you stop at a stoplight, if your hand naturally moves for your phone, that might be diagnostic that you've fallen into this diversion seeking pattern. The other thing, notifications are just as distracted as checking. So the rate at which we get these notifications matters. So really quickly, some things that you can consider about distractedness. I'll share one, maybe two specific examples, and then let's focus this for just a couple of minutes on decision-making specifically. If notifications are as distracting as checking, turn off as many as you can. Those red dots on your cell phone, the notification dots, those are designed to draw you in. The email notify that comes across the top of your screen, again, your brain reacts to them. One thing that you can do is change the rate at which your email client shows you that you have email. If it's instantaneous, you're going to have this constant bombardment of notifications. Maybe change it to half an hour. Then just two that I want to talk about really quickly. First, simplify the home page, the first 2 pages of your cell phone. Put the most important stuff there. The brain can handle 4, 5 items before it has to really engage. So here, don't judge me. Here are the first 2 pages of my phone. What I've done is I've put the most important apps down here in the ribbon. They're always available. The second most important 4 apps are the only 4 that are on my home screen. 90% of the time when I turn on my phone, it's there. I don't have to go searching for it. The second page has the next 8 apps that I use with any consistency. And so I don't have to engage my brain in order to find the apps that I use probably 95% of the time. And as we'll talk about in a second, every decision you make drains your brain. Last thing, and then we'll focus specifically on decision making for a couple of minutes. Binge watching was not a thing until Netflix changed its policy about serving up the next video. You may not remember, back in the day, you used to actually have to push a button to serve the next video. And Netflix changed it to the automatically start in 5 seconds thing. What the research shows is the human brain takes the default 80% of the time. When they changed this serve up next video, that's when binge watching became a thing. One can watch as many videos as you want, but make it your choice. Change it back to the default of you have to pick the next video. Just simple things that you can do to manage distractedness. So let's focus this on decision making, and then we'll move to the question and answer time. All of these things together show up in 2 broad impacts to decision making that have been named. 1, decision fatigue. Think of the brain as a limited amount of energy for making decisions. Every time you make a choice, regardless of how small the choice is, you use up a little bit of that decision-making power. So trying to decide where the app is on your cell phone uses up a little bit of your decision-making power. As you make more decisions over the day, the quality of the decisions that you make later tends to fall. Now, this graphic down here is just a fun one. There's no research that says it's 30 decisions a day. The idea is the more decisions you make in a day, the tendency is the quality of the decisions falls. Take advantage of that. Here's just a couple of specific things that you can do. Do you notice that Zuckerberg always wears the same thing? Unless he's in front of Congress, that's another story. Steve Jobs always wore the same thing. They were taking decisions away from the next day. They never had to decide about what they were going to wear. So little things, it doesn't sound like much, but these add up to big changes. Set out your clothes the night before. If you need to pack a lunch, pack it the night before. All of these little things, even as much as put your briefcase in your car before you go to bed, impact your reservoir of decision power the next day. Make the most important decisions first thing in the morning, if you can. If you can't, maybe these are general purpose for any time, but definitely if you have to make the hard decisions later in the day, first, minimize the distractions. Get a quiet space. Get everybody in the room to put their phones away for the focus on that decision. Fuel the brain. Get a snack. And here's a big one. Maybe prioritize what really needs your attention. What are decisions that you need to make, and maybe decisions that don't matter? And maybe spend a little bit more time. This is one thing that I learned from the book Essentialism. We pay so much attention to checking things off of our to-do list. What if we invested some energy into deciding what actually went on our list in the first place? The second one that I would describe really quickly, that is named impact of the things that we've been talking about on decision making, is ego depletion. In the same way the brain has a limited amount of decision-making power, it has a limited amount of self-control. And when it's used up, it's used up. And this is a fun example of at what time of day do we typically lose the self-control around the cookies. But there was another interesting piece of research. As people make more ethical decisions at some point in time, the likelihood they make a less ethical decision later goes up. Specifically, they looked at people who buy organic food and the likelihood they park in the handicap parking place. And it's a correlation. A lot of these studies are correlational, but as people bought more organic, the tendency was that the likelihood they would take that handicap parking place went up. We have a limited amount of self-control. So hardwire those temptations off. If your temptation is Netflix, definitely change that policy. If your temptation is chocolates, have chocolates around the house. Just keep them down in the basement. They're there, they're just harder to get to. You've hardwired the temptation off. If you can, limit the number of ethical or controversial decisions that you make in a day. And definitely, if you have lots of them, take a break. Now, these play out organizationally. Organizations are going to have to make choices about things like, if somebody travels, do we make them take a red eye? Those are choices that we're going to have to make as decisions soon. But I hope what you got from our webinar was a little bit of an understanding of the impact of sleep, stress, and distractions, first on human physiology, but then how that plays into decision making. And with that, Niato, can we open to questions?
Yes, we certainly can. Thank you so much, Steve, for a really engaging presentation. I think one of the first things I'm going to do is my home screen is a mess compared to yours. So I'm definitely going to try and implement that as a simple first step to reduce the number of decisions I have to make when looking for app. I thought that was really useful and applicable to, I'm sure, everyone on this call. Thank you all for sending in your questions. Continue to do so. We'll try to get to as many as we can in time remaining. First, a very simple question comes from Luis, and he wants to know your view on power naps and whether or not they have any impact regarding the earliest part of the conversation.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of napping. So there's a whole associated set of things. If one is tired, there's a few things that you could do. One, get outside and just walk. Being exposed to the sun tends to wake people up. Others, get a cup of coffee. Avoid coffee around after about 1 or 2. The half-life of coffee, caffeine from coffee, is about 4 hours. And so you got to be careful with that. A good 30-minute nap, particularly if you can take it before about 3 in the afternoon, can actually be restorative. You got to be careful if you sleep either too long or too late, it can impact your sleep that evening. But a quick 20-minute shut down before 3 o'clock, those are actually really good. It's a great question.
All right, great. The next question comes in from Cliff. Cliff would like to know if you can speak to the effects of lack of sleep or stress on the phenomenon of cognitive biases, and if I may be so bold as to add, if it may have impact on heuristics as well that we use every day.
Sure, absolutely. So if you think about the impact of lack of sleep and lack of sleep and higher levels of stress, even if it's that chronic long-term stress, what happens is people tend to fall into more risky decisions, less carefully thought out decisions. More or less, in that condition of less sleep and more stress, decision-making leaves the prefrontal cortex and moves back. What that means is executive functioning is basically turned off. We're likely to fall more victim to our own judgmental shortcuts, whether that's the anchoring bias or any of the other cognitive biases that we talk about. The executive center is where we ask questions like, why do we believe that? What if we're wrong? When you're either very tired or under stress, the brain kind of skips those pieces. So there's no definitive study that suggests that one bias or another will show up. But when you turn the executive center off, we all fall back on our own biases and judgments. Another great question.
Yeah, I think we have a number of good ones. This next one comes from Salif, and Salif would like to know regarding the decision-making process. He contextualizes just discussing the crazy world we live in, how we're bombarded with so much information on a daily basis. Salif is wondering, should we push back our decision-making to a later point in time in order to perhaps have a better effect or lessen the impact? I think it's the spirit of the question.
So there's a real tension here about decision process. Sometimes you have to make the decision at the time you have to make the decision. And it's not necessarily about having more time to make the decision. What I'd say is the thing that I would have you take from the work that we've been doing today is make sure that you are physiologically as strong as you can be, because that will make you as cognitively strong as you can be at the time you have to make the decision. So if you're forced to make a decision in the afternoon, a great thing that you can do before that meeting where you decide would be to take 5 minutes, walk around the building, eat an apple, grab a snack that will refuel the brain and have you prepared to make the decision. So it's not about deferring decisions as much as making sure that your brain and body are in their best possible condition when it's time to make the decision. There's a whole nother
Dovetailing,
body of research we can talk about that talks about how do you know when you have enough information.
great. Dovetailing from that question, Martin wants to know if there might be a best time of day to make business decisions.
Well, the book Essentialism uses the phrase, do hard things first. You're most alert early in the day. You've depleted your emotional, your decision making, and your willpower reserves least at the beginning of the day. If you have control over it, schedule those decisions for kind of first thing. And then as you're becoming more tired through the day, deal with important things, but maybe not the big, hard decisions. Do those first.
Great. The next question comes from Cliff, and Cliff would like to know if you can discuss whether extreme adrenal fatigue pattern has been correlated with decision makers involved in prolonged crises.
Prolonged crises. I don't have any information. I would expect that when one is in prolonged crisis, where the adrenal state is heightened for an extended period of time, I would expect that that would negatively impact decision making unless one is really well trained. But I don't have any evidence to specifically answer that question.
Coming in from Jennifer, Jennifer would like to know your views or if you have any advice on breaking the diversion-seeking habit, and how much time do you think it might take to break such a habit?
So the first thing I would say is the research into habit change is really interesting. Don't focus on the habit, focus on the thing that invokes the habit. It's called a cue. So if your habit is, when I pull up to the stoplight, that's a cue, that's a moment that says I should do something. The behavior, the habit, is to reach for the phone. What the research into habit change shows, and really clearly, if you focus on the habit, I'm not going to grab my phone, it's really hard to change the habit. Instead, focus on the cue that invokes the habit and change your response to that. So for example, put your phone in the back seat. Put a bag, I've got apples on my head, I'm just using that as an example. Put a bag of apples on the front seat. So it's already sliced. When you pull up to the stoplight, your hand's going to reach over there, just grab an apple. In a sense, what you're doing is you're hijacking a cue and changing the behavior that's attached to it. If you focus on, I'm not going to look at my phone, the research suggests that that's going to be really hard. Instead, if you can identify the cue and hijack the cue, that's going to increase the likelihood that you can make that change. Another great question.
Great. I think this will be the final question. Just keep an eye on time. This comes from Amanda. And so based on the feedback you're giving just now, you mentioned focusing on the cue for the behavior as the way to stop the habit that we are trying to break. I think Amanda is a great question that puts us within the context of where someone works, lives, or operates. So Amanda is in a context where multitasking is something that is the norm within the company, despite obviously we know we can't really do that now. And so essentially, this is an environment in which one is expected to check and respond to email, very, very rapidly. And so I'd imagine many of our listeners work in an environment where responsiveness is of the utmost importance. And so they have a built-in need to be distracted by checking email and being shown, to be responsive and on top of the game. So within such an environment where the environment is dictating such behavior, how does one go about implementing some of your suggestions when the environment, forces or reinforces such distracted behavior?
Absolutely. So there's two answers. One is, the first thing I do is check and see if that's really the expectation. Sometimes we get into this habit of that's what we do. We respond quickly. I know the following story will probably make most of you explode. I believed that my response to email was really, really important. But based on some things that I learned the last time that I left for a vacation with my family, my auto reply said something that sounds like, this isn't exactly right, but something that sounds like, I expect to have a very high volume of emails when I return. If you really need me, resend your note after this August 1st date. I didn't tell people this, but basically I deleted all the other emails. What I discovered is most of the decisions resolved themselves. That innate feeling that I had that people expected me to respond was as much self-imposed as culturally imposed. So a conversation with the boss to find out how much of it is just habit that then becomes part of the expectation, and then how much of it really is an expectation. So that would be one thing to do. The other is it's going to be slow to get organizations to recognize the impact of these things. There's a great article. It's entitled "The Organizational Cost of Insufficient Sleep." It was published in McKinsey Quarterly a while back. It starts to draw out how these ideas that we've been talking about are really getting traction inside organizations. But it's early. I would say the same way that 10 years ago, diversity and inclusion was a thing that we talked about of whether that was going to be a thing. And now here we are where it's completely accepted. What we've been talking about today is at that early stage as well. I think companies are going to figure out how to create a competitive advantage from rest. As odd as that sounds, they'll recognize that rest and attention are associated with higher levels of productivity. But we're
All
not
right,
there yet.
wonderful, thank you. We're going to bring things to a close. To everyone listening, I did share both the book recommendation of Essentialism in the chat, as well as the suggested reading from McKinsey. Both links are there available. Please go ahead and click them before we close this out. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. We once again hope there was a valuable use of your time. Thank you to Steve and to Goizueta Business School for partnering with Ivy Exec in this series of webinars. This was really, really great. I know I took a lot away. I hope everyone did as well. And Steve, I'll leave it to you for any final words for the audience.
Just one quick thought. The other thing that we know about habits is they change slowly and only if you pay attention to them. What I'd really encourage you to do is of the list of things that you could choose to change, pick one, pick two. Focus on those, rewiring the cue, if you will. Then when you've got that one settled, pick another one. Let it take some time. If you try to change everything at once, the research into habits change says that would be hard. So pick one or two and just get started.
All right, great parting words. Thank you to you. Thank you to everyone, and we'll see you soon. Take care.